My name is Hannah Eloise Mercer. I'm 29 years old and I live in Seattle. A fifth-floor apartment that smells like coffee grounds and rain, with a balcony that catches the light at 7 in the morning and the sound of the I-5 hum in the late nights. Right now, I work as an editor for a small non-profit magazine about housing policy. I pay my rent on time, I own 2 good coats, and I have a pile of unread self-help books that I tell myself I will actually open. Emotionally, I am a little raw, guarded, and constantly surprised by how much my chest can still ache over things that happened a decade ago. Some nights I lie awake and replay a stadium full of faces, not because I love nostalgia, but because the image of my parents sitting in plain silence while the world applauded somebody else never leaves me. Before I dive in, if you're into stories that land like a punch and keep echoing, please consider subscribing. I'm sharing a memory that still feels too loud sometimes, and I hope someone out there hearing this won't feel so alone. The day of my college graduation felt like a line drawn through the center of a life I thought I understood. The air outside Husky Stadium, damp, cold, the kind of northwest gray that smells like wet wool and the undercurrent of grilled hot dogs, had a kind of warped celebration to it. I remember the stadium announcer's voice, a ribbon of formal cheer, and the sound of 1,000 shoes against metal bleachers. My cap sat too tight on my head. The tassel brushed my cheek when I moved. I can still taste the cheap orange soda they sold at the concession stands. I practiced my walk in the mirror that morning like it was a speech to myself. I had earned everything that degree represented. Scholarships, late nights in the library when it smelled like old paper and ramen, the internship I took instead of going out freshman year, the friendships that were steady through everything. I had scaled a cliff that I couldn't explain to my parents, not because it was about the books, but because it was about being seen. When my name was called, the world narrowed to the stage, the microphone, the tassel, the handshake. I remember the smell of the stage, lacquered wood and something like sweat and the faint spray from the groundskeeper's hoses. I remember the student behind me whispering, "You got this." I remember putting my hand out and feeling the registrar's calloused grip as they passed me the diploma folder. For a split second, my stomach opened up into something like relief. Then I felt the absence. Clapping rose from the stands in waves, but not from where I thought it would matter. My parents were supposed to be in the 6th row, the place my father liked because of the light, the place my mother preferred because of the view. When I turned to find them, my heart stumbled into a place I wasn't expecting. Both of them were standing, but not for me. They were standing and laughing and waving at Claire. Claire, my older sister by 3 years, was on the other side of the stadium, perched on the visiting family aisle with a woman who wasn't our mother a decade back but who had been there through years of glossy hospital admissions and sleepless nights. Claire had thick, unruly hair then, the kind that seemed to have its own politics, and she wore a bright scarf that smelled faintly of lavender. She came forward into the aisle as if she'd been summoned. My mother was leaning forward, tears already in her eyes in a way I had never seen when the camera was on me. My father leaned over and barked something into the woman's ear. I heard him clear as a slap. "Your sister deserves the praise." The words felt like a verdict. The people around them, extended family, neighbors, someone from church, all turned to look at Claire when she stood. They cheered. They put up signs. They held their phones in the kind of way strangers do to make a moment official. By the time I rounded the podium and faced the crowd again, my parents were still turned to her. Applause rolling in a direction that did not include me. I tried to make sense of it in the moment. Claire had been through hell. There had been hospital stays, whispered phone calls late at night, a year when our house smelled like antiseptic and oranges. Everyone knew that. Our neighborhood conversations sometimes circled back to her nods of triumph. She had done the hard work of staying alive, the family had said. But this, the public reallocation of my small, longed-for moment, felt like something more personal. It felt like the only tangible applause I had earned that day had been redirected. I did what I could with the rest of the ceremony. I filed out of the stadium with the other graduates, the folder clutched in my hands like it might be a bomb or a lifeline. I let the crowd pool around me, let a few classmates say "congrats" in their breathless way that tried to be enough. My sister texted me a cheery emoji and a photo of the two of them laughing, the caption a casual "look at us," as if nothing had happened. My parents sent one message later, a photograph of Claire hugging a nurse, with the caption, "Proud of our girl." That night, in a cheap hotel room that smelled like floral cleaner and the highway, I opened a bottle of wine I hadn't planned to drink and let the sting rise like smoke. I felt invisible, not the blessedly unseen kind but the carved-out kind, the place where someone had carefully removed the parts they didn't like. It wasn't just the moment. It was the pattern. There had been a dozen other small numbs. The way my mother would walk past my room when I was 11 and barely nod. The way my father would spend 3 hours at Claire's appointment and then be too tired to stand at my high school play. I knew, with the doggedness of someone who has rehearsed her own pain, that the graduation was not a single act but a magnifying glass on a life that had always been tilted. If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people. I kept the applause in my chest like a stone. Familiar now, a weight I knew how to hold. I didn't see it would break me open in ways I couldn't predict. But I did know then that the silence of that day would shape years to come. The graduation was supposed to be an endpoint and, instead, it felt like the place where certain truths decided to stop being secret. The Mercer house smelled like lemon oil and the faint trace of hospital antiseptic for as long as I could remember. It was the kind of smell that tells you where your loyalties are expected to lie. In the corner of the living room lined with brochures about specialists. In the drawer that held prescription labels like tiny white flags of survival. Claire's illness. Autoimmune then, something mouthy and capricious later, wasn't a single event. It was a long series of seasons. It was a decade of rearranged calendars, of school plays missed and doctor's appointments scheduled in pencil. Our parents learned to live by the clock on the clinic wall in the basement of St. Luke's. The fluorescent light, a second kind of sun. My childhood was split into 2 jobs. The child I was supposed to be, and the adult in training I became overnight. I fed Claire cups of water at 2 in the morning, watching the steam rise in a kitchen that hummed with the refrigerator and the refrigerator hum of my father's quiet guilt. I walked to school alone sometimes, the cold cutting my cheeks till they stung, and told myself it was fine, that the world liked people who were self-sufficient. My mother rarely came to my teacher conferences. My father would give me a look that said both be proud and don't complain. The 2 things were not always compatible. The arc of favoritism was not simple. It wasn't that our parents didn't love me. It was that the language of love in our house had become first aid. Everything else got deprioritized, reallocated to the emergency of Claire's needs. Gifts were given with a trembling sort of gratitude, as if each breath Claire took was a miracle and couldn't be wasted on trivia like a graduation party. I resented it, quietly, the way resentment grows in the understory of a forest. Not always visible, but dense and breathing. Resentment sat in my chest as I worked nights to pay my way through school, resented my own need for acknowledgement, resented that my celebrated achievements weren't photographed with the same intensity, the same trembling hands. College offered me a kind of opiate of achievement. There, my worthiness was not negotiable. Professors didn't look at me with the tired, resigned compassion my mother gave. They asked for readings and deadlines and pushed me to write better. I fell in love twice, the teenage kind and then the quieter kind. And both times the people who loved me asked me what I wanted in clear language. I worked 3 jobs one semester, drank cheap coffee in study group rooms that smelled of stale air and post-it notes. And I loved the way my brain could hold tight to a paragraph and refuse anything else. But at every homecoming, I would return to the lemon oil and hospital brochures and the ritualistic devotion that had become our family's calendar. I once asked my father, sitting at the kitchen table while rain sounded against the windows like a slow applause I didn't want, "Do you ever think about me?" It was the most childish, blunt thing I could say, massive in its smallness. He looked at me like a map he's been given to fold, like there was an instruction manual he could not find. "Of course I do," he said. "In that way adults say things that don't land. You don't have to ask that." I started to believe my own quiet, that perhaps I had been asking for the wrong currency, that praise from them was never currency they had left enough of. So I found other markets. I took internships in offices that smelled like toner and ambition. I learned to sleep with one eye open and yet wake up and meet deadlines with a shame-fueled kind of zeal. I learned to put my accomplishments into a ledger and pay myself, Because who knew when the world would hand me applause the way my childhood home handed it out selectively? Yet the graduation, that bright public ledger entry, should have counted for something. The fact that it didn't redirected my trajectory. I left for the West Coast with a suitcase and a heart that had been taught to calculate worth in only a few terms. Prove, endure, move on. For a while, moving on worked. The gray rain of Seattle became a comfortable blanket, and I told myself repeatedly that escaping would be the same as healing. But silence is an elastic thing. Sometimes it snaps back. A month after graduation, my mother left a voice message that I didn't answer for 3 days. The voicemail was short, more practiced than real, the sort of thing she had written in her head and then said out loud. "Hannah, we love you. Claire's doing well. Call us when you can." I resented the passive broadcasting. I resented the way they had made my day about a different story. I resented that their discomfort with my success had become its own kind of violence. Quiet, slow, the sort that softened bone over years. If this is resonating with you, if you've ever felt like your moment was eclipsed, leave a comment below. I'm reading everything. It turned out I wasn't the only one who knew this kind of ache. But there is a problem with community. It can be an echo chamber for pain, a place where grief multiplies. The real work was not in validation but in finding the cause of that silence. I began to look for it in places I'd been told not to. In attic boxes, in the back of my parents' filing cabinet, in the strained way my mother looked at my sister when she thought no one was watching. There was a history there, folded and careful, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the graduation had not been a single act but a punctuation of a sentence that had been running for years. The thing about family is they're both the ones who taught you how to breathe and the ones who can take your air away without meaning to. After the graduation, the air between my parents and me stiffened into an architecture of small slights. Invitations became conditional, conversations light. My mother sent me photos of Claire with captions, "Still going strong," with exclamation points where punctuation could have been compassion. When I visited, we ate reheated lasagna and listened to the TV in the other room narrate a life that felt distant. I pleaded for acknowledgement in modes that felt childish and utterly human. Coffee cups left in the sink with notes, text messages carefully drafted and then erased, the controlled smile at holiday dinners when someone raised a glass and said, "To Claire," and then looked around as if the circle had naturally included us all. Honestly, I tried to forgive them. Forgiveness can feel like a job when you're working under the architecture of neglect. You write memos to your own heart reminding it to be charitable. You practice the phrases adults use. They did their best. But there's a point where best feels like a bandage on an open wound. I began doing things differently, small things at first. I stopped announcing big achievements over the phone. I started to invite only a handful of people to my shows and readings. I learned to clap for myself in empty rooms. Still, some part of me was a private investigator at heart. I couldn't let the silence stand when it had become a pattern. I went home one rainy October, under the pretext of laundry and borrowed sugar, but my feet had a different itinerary. The filing cabinet in the study had always been slightly ajar, as if making room for secrets. My father was in the garage. My mother was watering succulents in the kitchen and humming under her breath like someone trying to hallucinate happiness. I opened the cabinet, the metal catching on the drawer like a thought that doesn't want to be worked through. There were school records, insurance papers, a sheaf of letters tied with a worn elastic band. The letters were from the good hospital. Neat, serifed stationery with dates and signatures. At first, I assumed they would be about Claire's treatments, another season of appeals and approvals and tender solicitations for people's kind attention. But one of the envelopes contained something else. An application letter for a scholarship from long ago, when Claire was 17, marked "Denied, funds reallocated." Another paper was a brittle note from a guidance counselor, half apologetic, half practical. We had to reroute the award to patient care. Then, under those, there was a form I recognized like an old footprint, a single line item that made my stomach drop. A signed consent form, scrawled in ink that was not Claire's but mine, authorizing the deferral of my scholarship application in favor of family medical need. I remember the heat in my face, the way the kitchen light seemed too bright, the crack of thunder outside. I sat on the floor and read the documents again and again, like a person turning over a stone to find a small, preserved truth. I had never known that a scholarship I'd won in high school, one that might have alleviated so much of my later grind, was handed over. Not handed over by accident, but by design. There was a note in my father's handwriting, faded to brown at the edges. We had to make a choice. We thought it was the only way. I didn't stop to rationalize. I took the papers in my hands and found my mother in the garden. Her hands dirt-streaked, a tender old halo around everything. She looked up, and for once the practiced calm was absent. "Do you remember when we had to do the scholarship?" I asked because I needed the words to be true. She sat down on the stoop like someone slipping into a confession. "Claire was wrong then," she said, the sentence short and full of its own history. "She was sick. And the hospital money only stretched so far. We thought you would be okay. We thought you could manage." Her eyes were glassy, and when she said "we thought," there was a kind of pleading in the phrase, as if it could be a defense. "Manage," I repeated, tasting the word. "So you gave away what could have been mine because you thought I would, what? Work harder. Be collateral." She flinched. "We did what we had to. Your sister. She needed things that were not just medical. She needed the dignity of being seen. She needed people to tell her she survived. We were terrified of losing her. I am still terrified of losing her." It was at that moment that a different kind of thing unspooled in me. Not just anger but a dizzying rainfall of context. A shard of the subtext I'd been too hurt to entertain. There was guilt in their choices, and it had shaped what they offered. But there was also a possibility I hadn't considered until then. Their care for Claire had been less about shirking me and more about walking around a guilt that insisted on compensation. They were trying to rebalance a ledger that had been skewed toward frightening absence. That didn't make the hurt less real, but it began to color it. I left with a box of photocopies and a throat full of things I hadn't yet decided what to do with. For weeks, the documents lay on my desk, the edges curling, a paper trail that felt like a conclave of all the small, inevitable convergences that had made up my family. Was this them choosing love in the only way they'd been trained? Or was it them escaping responsibility for seeing me whole? That winter, an email arrived from my sister. It started with a joke about a mutual friend, and then, after a few lines that were soft and deliberate, she wrote, "We need to talk. There are things you should know about the scholarship. Please come home." I almost ignored it. I almost didn't go. If you want to keep hearing this, don't forget to subscribe. I promise the next part is where things get complicated. The afternoon I returned to the Mercer house felt like the sky had been peeled back. The air smelled like wood smoke and the lemons my mother kept in a bowl on the counter. Claire was waiting on the living room couch, an ordinary place for extraordinary truths. Up close, she looked thinner than she did in the photos my parents loved to circulate. Illness had its own geometry on the body. But her eyes had a steadiness I had not learned to see before. She held a mug with both hands, palms warm, and when she spoke it was as if she had been rehearsing the sentence in the quiet between her heartbeats. "Hannah," she said, "I didn't want this to be your story, but it is. Always has been. There are confessions that come like avalanches and those that arrive like a single, measured step. Claire's was the latter. She told me about the winter before my senior year of high school, a night I remembered as a blur of exams and a bad flu, and how she had called our father at 2 a.m. because a neighbor had slipped on the ice and broken his arm. An accident, but one that might have been linked to the way our family had been stretched thin. The hospital bills piled up. The scholarship committee, a small foundation connected to the high school, asked for verification of need. The family decided, as families decide when there's no good choice, that Claire's need deserved the money more. "I was the one who got sick in ways that were visible," she said. "I was the one who coughed and went to appointments and could make people nod. You were silent in a way that looked like endurance, and people always mistake endurance for needing less. So Dad signed the forms. I told him to." She looked at me and there was a strange, almost amused sorrow in her face. "I told him the scholarship could be reallocated here. I thought I was protecting you." "You told him to take my scholarship," I said. the weight of the paper in my hands suddenly heavier. You made it disappear. Claire's laugh was small and brittle and then turned into something like a sob. Yes, she said. I did. And I didn't tell you because I was ashamed. 'Cause I thought you would hate me. Because, she pressed her palms to her face. Because I wanted you to have parents who could breathe. I took it because I thought it would make the house smaller, make the debt manageable. I felt paralyzed by 1,000 small betrayals. Her secrecy, their justification, the way my life bent around a domino no one had meant to topple. But beneath all of that, there was a new, terrible familiarity. Claire had been raised in a theater of survival, where taking on guilt was a form of affection. She had performed sacrifice to preserve the household. The scholarship had been currency, and she had bartered with it to buy a fragile peace. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, not because I thought she had an obligation to report to me but because I wanted to know where the rubbing point was. Why would you decide that for me? She looked at me like someone who had rehearsed that look, the one that combines apology and explanation. Because every time I tried to tell the truth about what I needed, the house collapsed into panic. I couldn't handle being the reason everyone was sad. I thought, selfishly cowardly, that if I shoulder the burden it would be okay. When she said, selfishly, it hit me that she had given herself the currency of blame as if it were a talisman. She had been both the object of my parents' devotion and its architect in ways I had never allowed myself to imagine. Tears came like a verdict. Not purely relief, not purely anger. My body remembered 1,000 small winters and the way loneliness had scaled them. We sat in that room and took turns telling the truth. I told her about the nights I had stayed up trying to convince the world I was worth something. She told me about the years she had watched our parents oscillate between hope and debt. She spoke about the way the doctors praised her in public, and the way our father would cry quietly in the garage. She confessed that in lonely moments she had wanted to be the kind of person who could hold a family's tragedies like a trophy. She had also wanted, fiercely and selfishly, to be loved without competition. There was no tidy absolution. There was only the messy, delicious relief of being two people facing the same wound from different angles and finally letting the stitches show. Claire reached for my hand, and the touch was not a reconciliation as much as an initiation into a new honesty. I'm sorry, she said. I thought I was protecting you and our parents. I was protecting my own way of being seen. I hated you for a long time, I confessed. But I think I hated everyone harder because I didn't understand why. We spoke for hours, in a way we've never been able to when there was a wall of caretaking between us. We pored over the photocopies of the old forms. We listed the ways the house had been rearranged to meet emergencies and admitted, in the rawest way, that love had been imperfect. There were late-night moments where Claire would say things that made me sick with compassion. I wanted applause too, she said once, voice small. I got it not because I did something anyone else could see as accomplishment, but because I stayed. That was my job. It's not fair to you. Her fingers traced the rim of her mug like someone tracing the edge of a wound. I left that night changed, not because secrets had been solved, but because I had been led to the room where motives lived and had been given a flashlight. The revelation didn't undo the past. It only made the architecture of it legible. If this has touched you, share your story below. It will help others feel less alone in the messy truth that families are often both the place of refuge and the site of harm. The months after Claire's confession were not a miracle. There were no cinematic apologies that healed a decade of pain overnight. But there was something else. A slow reconfiguration. We began to make new rules. Conversations were scheduled like appointments. My parents learned, haltingly with the kind of humility that looks like awkwardness, to ask what I needed rather than assuming. They stopped using Claire's survival as a sort of currency in public settings. They learned to let me have moments that were mine. It was clumsy and imperfect, and more than once the old default of emergency sprang back up like an old bruise. I still felt the old ache. Some things were permanently altered. I had picked up habits, self-reliance that sometimes felt like armor, a reflex to deflect praise, a tendency to list my accomplishments quietly in my head and then throw that list into the trash. But Claire and I kept writing each other long emails. The kind you write when you live in the same city but are trying to learn how not to be strangers. We went for coffee and didn't bring up the past until we were ready. We learned how to laugh again in ways that didn't feel like survival. There was a final moment, small and quiet, that felt like the real turning point. A year after my graduation, my work hosted a small reading. I asked only a few people to come, close friends, colleagues, a former professor. Before I left the house, I texted my parents an address and the words, "If you want to come, no pressure." My mother texted back with a heart, then called me later that night and said quietly, "We will be there." They arrived late, because people who have spent years in the orbit of another person's medical calendar still rely on tardiness like a default defense. When I walked onto the small platform in the community center, the room smelled like lemon oil and old paper and community cookies. I read a piece that was, in its own quiet, the story I've told you. I read it with my hands shaking at first and then steadier, the way a voice settles when someone decides to own their story. At the end, during the thin applause that comes from a small room, my eyes scanned the audience. My parents were sitting near the back. My mother had a tissue in her hand, a small, polite smile. My father was hunched forward, listening like someone rediscovering how to breathe. Claire stood in the aisle, watching with a look that made my chest unclench in a new and fragile way. She mouthed sorry and then proud and then I love you in quick succession, and I felt the words as if they were small birds landing on my shoulders. Afterwards, my mother hugged me the way someone who has been given permission to hold again does. Awkward, earnest, genuine. My father hugged me too, and their embrace lacked the theatricality of the moments I had always wanted. It was simple and somehow enough. Claire came up last, her hands warm on my arms. "You did it," she said. "You deserved that, Hannah. I am sorry it took so long for us to see it." There is a lesson here I return to again and again. People do harm for many reasons. Some strategic, some fearful, some born of a kind of desperate love, and understanding the why does not erase the what. Doesn't excuse neglect. It does, however, allow for a different kind of ending than the one bitterness wants to script. Our family did not become a storybook of perfect late apologies. We became, very slowly, a group of people who could tell each other the truth without it detonating. If any of this feels familiar, if your praise was redirected or your applause was reanimated for someone else's survival, know this: your worth is not diminished by someone else's suffering. And sometimes the hardest path to take is the one where you allow complexity in, where you can be angry and tender and disentangled enough to love in a new way. Thank you for listening. If you're still here and this story reached you, please subscribe to hear more stories like this. Share it if you think someone needs to hear it. And if something like this has happened to you, feel free to share in the comments. I'm reading everything. Whatever your family looks like, may you find a room with honest light and someone who will learn how to clap for you.